Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where the dust never settles and legends are forged in gunpowder and grit. Tonight, we tell a story of a man who lost his voice but found his vengeance, a tale whispered in the silent language of a loaded six-shooter. The wind, a mournful whisper through the skeletal remains of what was once a bustling gold rush town, carried the reek of dust, despair, and cheap whiskey. This was Crimson Gulch, a place bleeding out under the boot heel of the Red Vultures. For a year, the townsfolk had learned to live with their heads bowed and their eyes downcast. To speak out against Jedediah Stone and his gang was to earn a swift and brutal end, with the gallows in the town square serving as a constant, grim reminder of the price of defiance. The Red Vultures were the law, and their justice was written with bullets and blood. They took what they wanted, bled the town dry, and left the people with nothing but the hollow echo of their own fear. It was into this suffocating silence that a stranger rode. He was a wraith on a pale horse, his face a roadmap of hardship carved by sun and sorrow. A thick and kempt beard obscured the lower half of his face, but it was his eyes that held the town captive. They were chips of flint, cold and hard, yet they burned with an infernal fire that seemed to suck the very warmth from the midday sun. He wore the dusty, trail-worn clothes of a man who'd ridden to hell and back, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, casting his features in perpetual shadow. But it was the twin gun belts, strapped high and tight to his thighs, that spoke the loudest. Each held a bone-handled Colt Peacemaker, the leather of the holsters worn smooth, the brass polished to a dull gleam by a familiar hand. These were not the tools of a farmer or a merchant. They were the instruments of a reaper. He dismounted before the saloon, the gilded cage, a place that had long since lost its luster. The swinging doors, one hanging precariously from a single hinge, groaned in protest as he pushed them open. The usual cacophony of drunken laughter and off-key piano playing died an instant death. Every eye in the room, from the bleary-eyed prospectors to the hard-faced vultures, swiveled to him. The air grew thick with a tension so palpable you could have cut it with a bowie knife. Jedediah Stone, a man built like a brick outhouse with a face like a clenched fist, sat at his usual corner table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in one hand and a cigarillo clamped between his teeth. He narrowed his eyes, a predatory glint in his piggy gaze. The stranger's eyes swept the room, pausing for a beat on each member of the Vultures, his expression unreadable. He moved toward the bar, the jangle of his spurs a death knell on the filthy floorboards. The bartender, a man named Bartholomew who had once been proud but was now a quivering wreck, fumbled with a glass, his hands shaking so badly that whiskey sloshed over the rim. The stranger didn't order a drink. He just stood there, a silent, imposing presence that seemed to grow with every passing second. Well, Jed's voice, a low, gravelly rumble, broke the silence. Look what the cat dragged in. A new stray in our little kingdom. He took a long drag from his cigarillo, the cherry glowing like a malevolent eye. You lost, friend. Or you just looking for a shallow grave? The stranger didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge Jed's taunt. He simply turned his head slowly, his flint-like eyes locking onto Jed's. And in that moment, a flicker of recognition, followed by a cold, hard wave of fear, washed over Jed's face. He had seen those eyes before. A year ago. In the face of a man he'd left for dead. A man whose tongue he had personally cut out. Silas Fane, the bounty hunter who had dared to stand against the Red Vultures. A collective gasp went through the saloon. The name, and spoken for a year, hung in the air like a phantom. Silas Fane, a man whose reputation with a gun was legendary. A man they had tortured and maimed, leaving him to bleed out in the desert sun. But he hadn't died. He had returned. And in his eyes, they saw not a man seeking justice, but a force of nature hell-bent on retribution. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of fear and submission. It was the silence of a held breath, the stillness before the storm. Silas Fane, the ghost of Crimson Gulch, was back. And with him, he had brought a reckoning. He didn't need a voice. His guns would do the talking for him. Jed, recovering from his initial shock, let out a booming laugh, though it sounded forced, brittle. Silas Fane, you gotta be kiddin' me. That fella's buzzard food. This is just some drifter with a death wish. He motioned to two of his men, hulking brutes with faces as intelligent as a bag of hammers. Flank, spank, show our guest the door, and make sure he understands what and welcome means. The two thugs swaggered toward Silas, their hands hovering over their sidearms. They were big, but they were slow. And they were stupid. A fatal combination when facing a man like Silas. As their hands dropped to their guns, Silas moved with a speed that was almost inhuman. His hands were a blur, his Colts clearing their holsters in a single, fluid motion. 2 shots rang out, so close together they sounded like one. Bang bang. Flank and Spank stood frozen for a half second, a comical look of surprise on their faces, before they crumpled to the floor, neat, crimson holes drilled through their foreheads. The saloon erupted into chaos. Patrons scrambled for cover, tables were overturned, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. Jed, his face a mask of rage and disbelief, fumbled for his own massive pearl-handled revolver. But Silas was already moving, a phantom in the swirling gunsmoke. He used the chaos, weaving between the overturned tables, his Colt spitting fire. Another vulture went down, clutching a gushing wound in his chest. A fourth screamed as a bullet shattered his kneecap. The fight was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. Silas was a whirlwind of motion, a ballet of death. He moved with the fluid grace of a dancer and the instincts of a predator. He didn't waste a single bullet. Each shot was a carefully placed message of mortality. In less than a minute, 5 of Jed's men lay dead or dying on the saloon floor. The remaining vultures, their bravado evaporated, cowered behind the bar, their eyes wide with terror. Jed, realizing he was outmatched, made a break for the back door. But Silas had anticipated it. A single shot from his Colt sent Jed's revolver clattering to the floor. Another shattered the whiskey bottle in his hand, showering him in glass and cheap liquor. Jed stumbled and fell, landing in a heap at the feet of the man he had wronged. Silas stood over him, his Colt still smoking, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter night. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The message was clear. This was only the beginning. The red vultures had sown the wind, and now they would reap the whirlwind. He holstered one Colt and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a single black feather. A vulture's feather. He let it flutter down onto Jed's chest, a silent promise of what was to come. Then, he turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving behind a scene of carnage and a group of terrified men who had just seen a ghost. The silence that fell over the gilded cage was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of the tomb. As Silas stepped back into the blinding sun, the townsfolk, drawn by the sound of gunfire, watched him with a mixture of awe and terror. They had witnessed the impossible. A dead man had returned to claim his vengeance. And they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that this was only the first drop of the coming storm. The ghost of Crimson Gulch had announced his return, not with a whisper, but with a roar of gunfire that would echo through the desolate canyons for a long time to come. The town held its breath, waiting to see what the tide of vengeance would bring. And Silas Vane, a lone figure against the harsh landscape, knew the blood that had been spilled was merely the prelude to the river that was about to flow. He had a debt to collect, and he would be paid in full, one bullet at a time. The vultures had taken his voice, but they had given him a purpose. And in the silent and forgiving world of the Wild West, a purpose was a more dangerous weapon than any gun. It was a fire that could not be extinguished. And Silas Vane was a conflagration waiting to happen. The aftermath of the saloon massacre settled over Crimson Gulch like a shroud. The bodies of the fallen vultures were dragged unceremoniously to a shallow and marked grave behind the blacksmith shop. Jedediah Stone, his pride as shattered as the whiskey bottle that had exploded in his hand, had barricaded himself in his fortified ranch on the outskirts of town. Surrounded by the handful of his men who hadn't been fast enough to flee, fear, a commodity more precious than gold in this desolate town, had a new face. It was the face of a silent, vengeful ghost. Silas Vane had not been seen since he'd walked out of the gilded cage. He had melted back into the harsh and forgiving landscape from which he had emerged, leaving the townsfolk to whisper his name in hushed, fearful tones. He was a patient man. He had learned patience in the year he'd spent nursing his wounds, burning hatred his only companion. He had learned to live with the silence, to find strength in it. The inability to speak had sharpened his other senses to a razor's edge. He had become a predator, and Crimson Gulch was his hunting ground. His first target was not Jed, but the source of the vultures' power, their supply line. Every week, a heavily guarded wagon train would arrive from the east, carrying the whiskey, ammunition, and other provisions that allowed the gang to maintain their iron grip on the town. Silas knew that to cripple the beast, he first had to starve it. He spent days observing the route, noting the patterns of the guards, the terrain, the points of weakness. The attack came at dawn. The wagon train was navigating a narrow pass, a natural bottleneck, a perfect kill zone. Silas had laid his trap with a hunter's precision. A carefully placed charge of dynamite, triggered by a single, well-aimed rifle shot, sent a cascade of rock and debris tumbling down, blocking the path ahead. As the wagons ground to a halt, the guards, caught by surprise, scrambled for their weapons. That's when the shooting started. Silas, perched on a high ledge overlooking the pass, was a phantom marksman. His long-barreled Sharps rifle spoke with deadly authority. One by one, the guards fell, each with a single, clean shot. They never saw him. Panic erupted. The remaining guards abandoned the wagons and fled into the canyons, hoping to escape the invisible killer. They didn't get far. Silas, moving with the agility of a mountain cat, picked them off one by one. When the dust settled, the wagon train was his. He took no whiskey, no provisions. He methodically smashed every bottle, pouring the contents onto the thirsty ground. He took only the ammunition, a precious resource for the war to come. And then, he set the wagons ablaze, sending a pillar of black smoke into the morning sky, a signal to Jedediah Stone that his empire was beginning to crumble. Back in Crimson Gulch, news of the destroyed wagon train spread like wildfire. The vultures, already on edge, were now in a state of near panic. Their supplies were cut, their leader was in hiding, and a ghost was hunting them in the canyons. Jed Stone, his face a thundercloud of rage, knew he had to act. He gathered his remaining men and announced his plan. They would ride into the canyons. They would hunt the ghost and put him in the ground for good. It was a reckless act, born of pride and fear. And it was exactly what Silas had been waiting for. He led them on a deadly chase, deeper and deeper into the labyrinthine canyons, into his territory. He had turned the entire landscape into a weapon. He had set snares, deadfalls, and ambushes. The first man died without a sound, a rope stretched across the trail catching him at the neck and snapping it clean. Panic began to set in. They fired wildly into the shadows, their bullets ricocheting uselessly off the canyon walls. Silas herded them like cattle, funneling them into a box canyon, a natural stone amphitheater. It was here he would make his stand. He appeared on a ledge above them, a silhouette against the dying sun. He stood there for a long moment, his rifle held loosely in one hand. The vultures, their faces pale with terror, knew they were about to die. Jed, his bravado finally gone, raised his pistol. "Vane," he screamed, his voice hoarse with terror. "Damn you to hell." He fired, his shot echoing through the canyon. But Silas was already gone, having dropped to a crouch the moment Jed raised his weapon. The bullet whistled harmlessly over his head. And then, the symphony of death began anew. The Sharps rifle barked, and another vulture fell, and another, until only Jed was left, standing alone amidst the bodies of his men, his gun empty, his face a mask of utter despair. Silas rose, his rifle smoking, and looked down at the man who had taken his voice. He didn't fire. That would be too easy, too quick. He wanted Jed to suffer. He wanted him to live with the fear, with the knowledge that his time was running out. He simply stood there, a silent, implacable judge, his shadow stretching long in the fading light. Then, he turned and melted back into the darkness, leaving Jed alone with his dead and the ghosts of his past. The whispers in the dust had become a roar, and the name Silas Vane was no longer a myth. It was a promise. The sun beat down on Crimson Gulch with a merciless intensity, mirroring the simmering tension that gripped the town. Jedediah Stone, a paranoid recluse in his fortress-like ranch, was a cornered animal, and Silas knew a cornered animal was the most dangerous. The final confrontation had to be on his terms. The turning point came in the form of a boy, no older than 10, named Toby. He was the son of the town blacksmith, a man who had suffered greatly under the vulture's rule. Toby, with the innocent courage of a child, had been secretly leaving food and water for Silas at a designated spot in the canyons. He saw Silas not as a killer, but as a hero from one of the dime novels he loved to read. One evening, Toby was captured by two of Jed's men. Jed, seeing the boy, saw an opportunity, a way to draw Silas out. He sent a message to the town. Silas Vane was to present himself in the town square at high noon the next day. If he failed to appear, the boy would hang. Silas, hidden in his canyon sanctuary, received the news from a frantic Barty, the saloon keeper. As Barty relayed the situation, Silas's face, normally a mask of stoicism, hardened into granite-like resolve. His eyes, cold as a winter night, now blazed with a righteous fury. This was no longer just about revenge. It was about justice. The next day, as the sun reached its zenith, the town square was a tableau of fear and anticipation. The gallows stood in the center, a grim testament to Jed's cruelty. Young Toby, his face pale but his eyes defiant, stood on the platform, a noose around his neck. Jed and his remaining men were positioned on rooftops and in the windows of the surrounding buildings. They had turned the town square into a killing field. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. Then, as the town clock began to strike 12, a lone figure appeared at the end of the main street. It was Silas Vane. He was on foot, walking slowly, deliberately, toward the square. He was dressed in black, his hands empty at his sides. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. Well, Jed called out, his voice dripping with malicious glee. The ghost decided to attend his own funeral. As Jed raised his hand to signal the hangman, a shout rang out. But it didn't come from Silas. It came from the church bell tower. The hangman crumpled to the ground, a neat hole in his forehead. Chaos erupted. Jed's men, confused and disoriented, began firing wildly. But they were firing at shadows. The townsfolk, inspired by Silas's courage and a year of pent-up rage, had decided to fight back. Led by the blacksmith, Toby's father, they had armed themselves with hunting rifles, pistols, even pitchforks and axes. They were no longer sheep. They were a pack of wolves. The vultures, caught in a crossfire, were picked off one by one. Amid the chaos, Silas moved with lethal purpose. While the town fought, he sprinted for the gallows. He leaped onto the platform, Bowie knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. With a single, swift motion, he severed the rope around Toby's neck, freeing the boy. Jed, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, saw his plan unraveling. He was alone now, his men dead or dying. He leveled his pistol at Silas, but Silas was ready. As Jed fired, Silas shoved Toby to safety and drew his Colts. The two men, the ghost and the tyrant, faced each other in the center of the town square, the air thick with gunpowder and death. The gunfight was a blur of motion and sound. But Silas was faster, more accurate. A bullet grazed Jed's shoulder, another tore through his leg, sending him sprawling into the dust. Jed lay there, his gun empty, beaten and broken. Silas walked toward him, his face a grim, unforgiving mask. He stood over Jed, his Colt aimed at the man's head. "Do it," Jed spat, a bloody grin on his face. "Send me to hell." Silas looked down at him, his eyes devoid of any emotion. He had come here for revenge, for the satisfaction of seeing this man die. But as he looked at the pathetic, broken figure at his feet, he felt nothing. Killing him now would be an act of mercy, not vengeance. He holstered his Colt. He would not give Jed the easy way out. He would leave him to live, a crippled, powerless man in a town that despised him. That was a fate worse than death. He turned and walked away, leaving Jed to the mercy of the townsfolk. They surrounded him, their faces a mixture of hatred and contempt. They didn't kill him. They branded him with the mark of the vulture and then exiled him from the town, sending him out into the desert with no horse, no water, and no hope. As Silas watched Jed stumble into the unforgiving wilderness, he knew his work was done. He had not only claimed his vengeance, but he had given the town of Crimson Gulch a new beginning. He had helped them find their courage, their voice. The weeks bled into months, and an uneasy peace settled over Crimson Gulch. The gallows were torn down, and the gilded cage was renamed the Phoenix, a symbol of the town's rebirth. The people, once cowed and subservient, now held their heads a little higher. They had found their courage in the crucible of violence, and they were determined to forge a new future. But a power vacuum in the West is an invitation. The new threat was not a gang of thugs, but a far more insidious predator, a wealthy, charismatic land baron named Augustus Kane. Kane arrived with a retinue of well-dressed, well-armed men and a seemingly endless supply of gold. He bought up deeds to abandoned properties, offered loans to struggling ranchers, and financed the rebuilding of the town. On the surface, he was a savior. Beneath the polished veneer, however, lay a cold, calculating ambition. Cain didn't want to rule the town with fear. He wanted to own it, body and soul. Meanwhile, Silas Vane had not ridden off into the sunset. He had carved out a new life for himself in a secluded valley, a hidden paradise of green grass and clear water. He had built a small log cabin, cleared a patch of land, and found a quiet solitude that soothed his tormented soul. He was no longer the ghost of Crimson Gulch. He was just a man, trying to outrun the phantoms of his past. But the past has a long reach. News of Augustus Cain and his growing influence reached Silas through the occasional prospector who stumbled upon his hidden valley. He listened to their stories with a growing sense of unease. He recognized the pattern. His fears were confirmed when a delegation from Crimson Gulch, led by the blacksmith and Barty, sought him out. They told him of Cain's machinations, of how he was slowly but surely strangling the life out of the town, forcing people into debt, and then seizing their property when they couldn't pay. They were losing their town all over again, not to the brute force of the vultures, but to the slow, suffocating grip of greed. Silas listened, his face an unreadable mask. He had no desire to return to a life of violence. But as he looked at the desperate faces of the men who had fought beside him, he knew he could not turn his back on them. He had a debt to this town, a debt that went beyond revenge. He agreed to return, but this time, it would be different. This would not be a war fought with guns and bullets. It would be a war of wits, a battle of wills. Cain, of course, learned of Silas's return. He saw Silas not as a threat, but as a challenge. He invited Silas to his lavish, newly built mansion overlooking the town. The meeting was a tense, silent game of chess. Cain, with his honeyed words and easy charm, tried to find a chink in Silas's armor. He offered him money, land, power. Silas, in his customary silence, simply listened. He let Cain talk, let him reveal his hand. He saw the avarice in his eyes, the contempt he held for the common folk. He refused Cain's offer with a simple, final shake of his head. The battle lines were drawn. Silas, with the help of the blacksmith, Barty, and a small group of trusted townsfolk, began to quietly investigate Cain's past. They sent letters to lawmen in other territories, to journalists, to anyone who might have information. What they uncovered was a history of fraud, blackmail, and even murder. Augustus Cain was a chameleon who had left a trail of ruined lives and broken communities in his wake. Armed with this information, they planned to expose Cain at a town meeting he had called to announce his generous offer to buy out the entire town. They printed flyers with the evidence they had gathered and distributed them just before the meeting. As Cain stood on the balcony of his mansion, addressing the crowd with sugar-coated promises, the townsfolk began to read the flyers. A murmur went through the crowd, a murmur that grew into a roar of anger and outrage. Cain, his face a mask of fury, realized he'd been outmaneuvered. He had underestimated the silent man and the power of a united community. His men, seeing the tide turn, drew their weapons. But the townsfolk, no longer timid sheep, stood their ground. Before a shot could be fired, the thunder of hooves echoed through the town. A posse of U.S. Marshals, summoned by one of Silas's letters, rode into the square. The lead marshal, a grizzled veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, arrested Cain and his men, ending their reign of terror. The town of Crimson Gulch was, once again, free. Silas Vane stood in the crowd, a silent observer. He hadn't fired a single shot, but he had won a victory more significant than any gunfight. He had taught the town that the greatest weapon against tyranny wasn't violence, but truth and unity. His work was done. He was free to return to his valley. But as he turned to leave, he felt a small hand slip into his. It was Toby, the blacksmith's son. The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with hero worship. He didn't say a word. He just squeezed Silas's hand, a silent expression of gratitude that spoke volumes. Silas looked down at the boy, and then out at the town, a community forged in the fire of adversity. He had come here seeking revenge, but he had found something more. He had found a home. He did not return to his valley. He stayed in Crimson Gulch, a silent guardian, a watchful protector. The scars of his past would always remain, but here, in the heart of this resilient little town, he had finally found a place where he could begin to heal. The ghost had found his peace, not in the silence of solitude, but in the quiet strength of community. A year passed. Crimson Gulch, under the watchful, silent gaze of Silas Vane, flourished. The Phoenix Saloon was loud with laughter, the blacksmith's hammer rang with purpose, and the fields beyond the town yielded a bountiful harvest. Silas, living in a small cabin on the edge of town, became a part of the community's fabric. He was no longer a ghost or a legend, but a neighbor. He would help raise a barn, share a silent meal with the blacksmith's family, and listen to the town's children read stories to him on the steps of the general store. The silence that had once been a mark of his trauma became a source of comfort for the town, a steady, quiet presence that spoke of strength and security. He was their protector, and for the first time since he lost his voice, Silas felt a semblance of peace. But peace in the West is a fragile thing, often shattered by the echo of past violence. The echo arrived in the form of a U.S. Marshal's badge and a wanted poster. The Marshal, a grim-faced man named Elias Thorne, rode into town with a posse of deputies. The wanted poster bore a crudely drawn but unmistakable likeness of Silas Vane. The name on the poster, however, was different: Silas the Spectre Kane. The crimes listed were a litany of brutality, robbery, murder, and a stagecoach massacre in the Montana Territory, crimes committed a year prior, during the time Silas was healing and hardening his heart for his return to Crimson Gulch. Thorne, a man who saw the world in the stark black and white of the law, confronted Silas in the middle of the town square. The townsfolk, loyal to the man who had saved them twice over, formed a protective circle around him. They spoke up for him, recounting his deeds, attesting to his character. The blacksmith, his voice booming with conviction, told Thorne that Silas had been in Crimson Gulch during the time of the alleged massacre. A man can't be into places at once, Marshal, the blacksmith argued. Thorne was unmoved. The law is the law, he stated flatly, and the evidence is damning. Witnesses describe a silent killer, a ghost with a gun. Fits your man to a T. He's coming with me. Silas knew arguing was pointless. He also knew who was behind this. The name on the poster knew as a clue. Before he became a bounty hunter, Silas had ridden with a partner, a man named Caleb Kane. They were more than partners, they were like brothers. But Caleb had a darkness in him, a love for killing that went beyond the job. Their partnership ended violently when Silas tried to stop Caleb from slaughtering a group of surrendering outlaws. Silas was wounded, and Caleb left him for dead, disappearing into the territories. Silas realized with a cold dread that Caleb must have survived. And now, he was not only committing atrocities under Silas's own grim moniker, the Spectre, but he was deliberately framing him for them. It was a twisted form of revenge, a way to destroy Silas's life and newfound peace from afar. Knowing he could not endanger the town by resisting, Silas made a decision. He laid his gun belt on the ground, a gesture of surrender. He would go with Thorne, but he would not go to the gallows. He would find a way to escape and hunt down Caleb, to clear his name and put an end to his phantom brother's reign of terror. As Thorne's posse led him away in chains, Silas locked eyes with Toby. In the boy's tear-filled eyes, he saw not doubt, but faith. It was a silent promise that steeled his resolve. He would return. He would not let the echo of a past he thought long buried destroy the future he had just begun to build. The hunt was on again, but this time, he wasn't hunting for vengeance. He was hunting for the truth. The journey to the territorial prison in Laramie was long and arduous. Marshal Thorne, though rigid in his adherence to the law, was not a cruel man. He saw the way Silas carried himself, the quiet dignity that even chains could not diminish, and a seed of doubt began to sprout in his mind. He'd seen killers before, and Silas Vane did not fit the mold. The escape happened on the fifth night. A fierce thunderstorm rolled across the plains, turning the landscape into a chaotic symphony of wind, rain, and lightning. In the confusion, as the deputies struggled to control the spooked horses, Silas moved. He had spent days observing the guards, noting their routines, the slight laxness that came with exhaustion. He had also worked tirelessly, silently, using a small piece of metal he'd pried from the wagon bed to weaken a link in his chains. With a sudden, explosive burst of strength, he snapped the weakened link, disarmed a stunned deputy, and disappeared into the raging storm. He did not kill the man. He simply took his horse and his gun and vanished into the night like the specter he was accused of being. Now a fugitive from the law he once served, Silas began his hunt for Caleb Kane. He was a ghost in his own right, moving through the underbelly of the West, through lawless towns and hidden outlaw camps. His reputation, both the real one and the one Caleb had fabricated, preceded him. Some men feared him, others challenged him, and all of them underestimated the silent man with the burning eyes. He picked up Caleb's trail in a dusty saloon in the Nebraska Territory. A trembling card sharp, remembering the chilling silence of a man who had killed his opponent over a disputed hand, described a man who matched Caleb's description perfectly. The trail led him north, toward the Badlands of Dakota, a place as wild and unforgiving as Caleb's own heart. Along the way, Silas discovered the true extent of Caleb's depravity. He found towns terrorized, families shattered, and a trail of bodies left in the wake of Silas the Spectre. Caleb wasn't just killing, he was crafting a narrative. A bloody legend designed to erase the man Silas had been and replace him with a monster. He was stealing Silas's identity, piece by violent piece. The hunt also brought an unexpected shadow, Marshal Elias Thorne. The escape had solidified Thorne's suspicions. A truly guilty man would have run for the border. Silas, however, was heading deeper into dangerous territory, following the very trail of the crimes he was accused of. Thorne, a man dedicated to the truth of the law, not just its letter, began his own investigation, quietly following Silas, observing him from a distance. The two hunters, one of men and one of truth, converged on a remote, windswept town called Purgatory's Gate, a haven for the worst dregs of the frontier. It was here, Silas learned, that Caleb had established himself as a king. His gang of cutthroats holding the town in a grip of fear even tighter than the one the Red Vultures had held over Crimson Gulch. Silas rode into Purgatory's Gate not as a ghost, but as a storm. He did not seek to hide in the shadows. He rode down the center of the main street, a direct challenge. Caleb, standing on the balcony of the town's only two-story building saloon he'd renamed the Spectre's Roost, looked down at the man he had betrayed. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Brother," Caleb called out, his voice dripping with mock affection. "I knew you'd come. You always did have to clean up my messes." The townsfolk scattered, seeking cover. The final confrontation was at hand. It was a battle not just for Silas's name, but for his very soul. He had to face the phantom who wore his face, the brother who had become his dark reflection. The silence before the storm was absolute. Purgatory's Gate became a ghost town, its inhabitants hidden behind barred doors and shuttered windows. On the balcony stood Caleb Kane, flanked by his most trusted killers, a king looking down on a lone challenger. In the street below stood Silas Vane, a solitary figure of quiet resolve. "You've come a long way to die, oh brother," Caleb sneered, his voice echoing in the naturally quiet street. "I've made a name for myself. A better name than you ever had. The Spectre. It has a certain ring to it, don't you think?" Silas didn't respond. He simply let his gaze drift from Caleb to the men beside him, his flinty eyes taking their measure. He had learned from his battle in Crimson Gulch. A direct assault on a fortified position was a fool's errand. He needed to even the odds. His hand blurred toward his Colt, but he didn't draw on Caleb. He fired 2 shots, and possibly fast, at the thick ropes holding up the saloon's massive wooden sign. The sign, emblazoned with the Spectre's Roost, creaked, groaned, and then crashed down onto the balcony, taking 2 of Caleb's men with it in a splintering roar of timber and bone. In the ensuing chaos, Silas was already moving. He dove behind a water trough as the remaining outlaws on the balcony opened fire, their bullets chewing up the street where he had been standing. The battle for Purgatory's Gate had begun. It was not a single gunfight, but a running battle that consumed the entire town. Silas used the layout of the streets, the alleys, the rooftops to his advantage. He was a phantom, striking and fading back into the shadows, his Colt speaking in short, deadly sentences. He was not the vengeful wraith who had descended on Crimson Gulch. This was colder, more precise. He was a surgeon, cutting the cancer of Caleb's gang from the heart of the town. One by one, Caleb's men fell. Some died in a hail of bullets, others in cleverly laid traps. Through it all, Caleb remained in the ruined saloon, watching his empire crumble, his rage building into a fever pitch. He had expected a simple duel, a final, triumphant execution. Instead, Silas had turned his own fortress into a tomb. As the last of his men fell silent, Caleb knew it was over. He stepped out of the saloon and into the street, his face a mask of pure hatred. "All right, Silas," he screamed, his voice raw. "No more games. You and me. Let's end this." Silas emerged from an alleyway, his face grim, his Colts held ready. The two men, once brothers, now mortal enemies, faced each other in the dusty street, surrounded by the bodies of the men who had followed the false specter. But before they could draw, another voice cut through the tension. "Hold it, both of you." Marshal Elias Thorne stepped out from behind the blacksmith shop, his shotgun leveled. His posse of deputies emerged from other points of cover, their weapons trained on both Silas and Caleb. "I've seen enough," Thorne said, his eyes fixed on Caleb. "I've been listening to the good people of this town. They tell a different story than the one on your wanted posters, Kane." Caleb laughed, a high and hinged sound. "The law. You're too late, Marshal. This is between me and my brother." In a flash, Caleb drew his pistol, not on Silas, but on Thorne. But Silas was faster. His Colt was already in his hand. A single shot rang out. Caleb staggered, a look of surprise on his face, as a red flower blossomed on his chest. He looked down at the wound, then up at Silas, a flicker of the brotherhood they once shared passing through his eyes before they glazed over. He crumpled to the ground, dead. Silence descended once more. Thorne slowly lowered his shotgun, his gaze shifting to Silas. He walked over to Caleb's body and picked up the wanted poster that had fallen from his pocket. He looked at the drawing, then at Silas, then at the dead man on the ground. "It seems I've been chasing the wrong ghost," Thorne said, his voice low. He tore the wanted poster in half and let the pieces flutter to the dusty ground. "Silas Vane, you're a hard man to find, and a harder man to kill." He turned to his deputies. "Our work here is done. This man," he said, nodding toward Silas, "was never here. We found the man we were looking for. Justice has been served." Thorne looked at Silas one last time. "Go home," he said. It wasn't a command, but a release. Silas gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. He turned his back on the carnage of Purgatory's gate, on the body of his phantom brother, and on the lawman who had chosen truth over procedure. He holstered his pistols, found his horse, and began the long ride back to Crimson Gulch. The echo of violence had been silenced. He was finally, truly, going home. The ride home was different. The relentless urgency of the hunt was gone, replaced by a heavy exhaustion that seeped deep into Silas's bones. He was not returning as a conqueror, but as a man who had stared into the abyss of his own past and been forced to kill what was once a part of him. The silence of the open plains, which had once been a comfort, now felt vast and empty. Each mile brought him closer to Crimson Gulch, but the peace he had known there felt a world away, a fragile dream he was afraid he might shatter upon his return. He arrived not at high noon with the sun at his back, but in the soft, forgiving light of dusk. He stopped his horse on the ridge overlooking the town and simply watched. He saw the warm, inviting lights flicker on in the windows of homes, the smoke curling from chimneys, the faint sound of laughter from the Phoenix Saloon. It was a picture of the life he had fought for, the community he had protected. But he no longer felt a part of it. He was a man marked by violence, a specter who had brought death to two towns. He wondered if his presence would only ever be a magnet for trouble, a constant shadow threatening the light they had all worked so hard to build. As he sat there, wrestling with his own ghosts, a small figure detached from the town and began the slow climb up the ridge. It was Toby. The boy, now a year older and with a quiet maturity in his eyes, had been watching the horizon every evening since Silas had been taken. He approached not with the boisterous energy of a child, but with the steady calm of an old friend. He stopped a few feet from Silas's horse and simply stood there, holding a freshly baked apple pie, still warm from his mother's oven. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Toby held up the pie, a simple, profound offering of welcome. It was not a tribute to a hero or a killer. It was a gift for a neighbor who had been away and had finally come home. In that small gesture, the walls Silas had built around his heart began to crumble. He slowly dismounted, the aches of the journey making him feel older than his years. He took the pie from the boy, the warmth of it seeping into his hands. He looked down at Toby, then back at the town lights, and for the first time in a long, long time, he felt the weight of his past begin to lift, replaced by the simple, grounding weight of a pie offered in friendship. He gave Toby a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks, a gesture that conveyed more gratitude than words ever could. Together, man and boy, they walked down the ridge and back into the warm embrace of the town. His return was not met with fanfare or parade, but with a quiet, collective sigh of relief. The townsfolk had heard the news, as news always travels in the West. Whispers of a final gunfight in a town called Purgatory's Gate, of a U.S. Marshal clearing the name of the silent man from Crimson Gulch. They greeted him not with questions, but with simple acts of welcome. The blacksmith gave him a firm, reassuring clap on the shoulder. Barty, the saloon keeper, had a bottle of his best whiskey waiting on the bar, no charge. But just as a new peace began to settle, a different kind of rider appeared on the horizon. It was a lone man, leading a pack horse. It was Marshal Elias Thorne. Thorne did not ride in with the bluster of the law. He dismounted, tied his horse, and walked directly to where Silas was sitting on the porch of the general store, watching the sunset. The townsfolk tensed, a silent fear that the law had changed its mind. The marshal stopped before Silas, his face etched with weariness. He unpinned the tin star from his chest. It felt heavy in his hand, heavier than it ever had before. "I'm done, Vane," Thorne said, his voice raspy with trail dust. Purgatory's Gate. It was the last straw. 4 years, I've served the law. I've sent men to the gallows believing I was serving justice. But out here, the line between the two gets blurred. I saw a good man, hunted for the crimes of a monster. And I saw a town so broken by lawless men that they welcomed the monster because he brought a brutal kind of order. The law I served didn't fix that. It just showed up to count the bodies. He looked at the badge in his hand, then at Silas. This town, you've done more for it than any lawman ever could. You didn't just kill the bad men. You showed the good people how to be strong. That's a different kind of justice. It ain't written in any law book. With a sudden, decisive movement, he held the badge out to Silas. "I'm moving on," Thorne said. "Heading west, maybe start a ranch. Find a place where a man's character matters more than the words on a piece of paper. But this town needs a lawman. Not one sent by some politician 1,000 miles away. One of their own. Someone who understands that justice isn't always about a hanging rope. Sometimes it's about giving people the safety to build something better." Silas stared at the offered badge, the setting sun glinting off its polished surface. It was the one thing he had never been, the one thing he never thought he could be. He was a hunter, a killer, a ghost. The idea of pinning that star to his chest, of representing the very system that had so recently condemned him, felt like a cruel joke. He shook his head, a slow, definitive refusal. Thorne didn't seem surprised. He simply placed the badge on the porch railing beside Silas. "Think about it," he said. "This town trusts you. They don't need your voice. They need your judgment. And from what I've seen, it's the truest I've ever come across." Marshal Elias Thorne tipped his hat, turned, and walked away, leaving not just the town, but his entire former life behind him. Silas sat there long after the sun had set, the silver star gleaming in the moonlight. He picked it up. It was heavy. It was the weight of responsibility, the weight of a future he had never imagined, the weight of a community's faith. He had spent so long defined by the violence of his past. The badge offered a different definition. It offered a chance not to be the specter who haunted the guilty, but the guardian who protected the innocent. The question that echoed in the vast silence of his mind was no longer about revenge or survival, but one he had never dared to ask himself. Who was Silas Vane, if he wasn't a killer? The answer, perhaps, was resting in the palm of his hand. The silver star sat on the mantelpiece in Silas's small cabin for a week, a silent, gleaming question in the dim light. To Silas, it felt less like a symbol of honor and more like a brand. He was a man who operated in the shadows, outside the lines. The star represented order, rules, a world he had long since abandoned. How could a ghost wear a star? How could a man who had dispensed his own brutal form of justice now be expected to uphold a set of laws he knew were often flawed and blind? The town, sensing his conflict, gave him space. But their faith in him was a quiet, constant pressure. They began to bring their disputes to him, not as a lawman, but as the respected elder he had become. A rancher complaining about a neighbor's fence encroaching on his land, a dispute between two prospectors over a claim, even a domestic squabble between the baker and his wife. Silas would listen, his flinty eyes seeming to see straight through the bluster and anger to the heart of the matter. He would render his judgment not with words, but with a simple gesture, moving a fence post back to its rightful spot, drawing a clear line in the dirt between the two claims, or simply sitting with the baker and his wife in their kitchen until their anger subsided into weary reconciliation. He was the law, whether he wore the badge or not. The tipping point came with the spring thaw. The melting snows swelled the Crimson River, threatening to flood the lower pastures and wash away the town's fledgling cattle herds. A new dam was needed, a massive undertaking that required the entire community to work together. But old feuds and stubborn pride created friction. Ranchers argued over whose land would be used, who would supply the timber, and who would lead the effort. The project stalled before it even began, bogged down in bickering and mistrust. The blacksmith, his face etched with worry, came to Silas's cabin. "They won't listen to reason," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "Everyone's so afraid of losing a foot of land, they're willing to risk losing everything. They need a leader, Silas. Someone they'll all listen to. Someone to remind them we're all in this together." Silas looked from the blacksmith's earnest face to the star on his mantelpiece. He understood then that the badge wasn't about him. It wasn't about his past, his silence, or his sins. It was about the town and its future. It was a symbol they needed, a focal point for their trust. It was a tool, and like his Colt's or his Sharp's rifle, it was time to learn how to use it. The next morning, Silas walked into the center of town. The ranchers and townsfolk were already gathered, their arguments starting anew in the crisp morning air. They fell silent as he approached. With slow, deliberate movements, Silas took the star from his pocket and pinned it to his vest. The metal felt cold against his chest. He didn't speak. He simply picked up an axe, slung it over his shoulder, and began walking toward the river and the tall pines that grew along its banks. For a moment, the crowd stood frozen. Then, a single figure moved to follow him. It was Toby, who grabbed the smaller axe and fell into step behind Silas. Then the blacksmith, with a nod of satisfaction, retrieved his own heavy felling axe and joined the silent procession. One by one, then in pairs, then in a flood, the others followed. The arguments were forgotten, the feuds set aside. Their quiet, reluctant lawman had shown them the way, not with a command, but with a simple act of will. For weeks, Silas led the construction of the dam. He was the first on site every morning and the last to leave at night. He worked harder than any of them, his silence a stark contrast to the cacophony of axes, saws, and shouted instructions. He was a natural leader, his judgment sound, his vision clear. He settled disputes with a look, directed the placement of logs with a point of his finger, and inspired the men with his own tireless example. During the construction, a new threat emerged. A small band of desperate outlaws, remnants of a larger gang broken up by the law in the next territory, saw the bustling, distracted town as an easy target. They planned to raid the general store and the blacksmith shop, where the town's payroll was temporarily being held. They rode in at dusk, expecting to be met with little resistance. What they found was a town that was no longer soft. The men building the dam were hardened, united, and armed, and they were led by a lawman who, despite the star on his chest, was still the deadliest man they had ever seen. The fight was not a chaotic saloon brawl. It was a coordinated, disciplined defense. Silas, directing his deputies with hand signals from the roof of the general store, outmaneuvered the outlaws at every turn. He funneled them into an ambush in the main street, his own rifle shots picking them off with chilling precision. The outlaws, expecting a flock of sheep, had stumbled into a wolf pack led by a ghost. When the dust settled, the raiders were either dead or captured, trussed up and waiting for the circuit judge. Silas stood on the rooftop, his rifle still warm, the star on his chest catching the last rays of the setting sun. He was no longer Silas Vane, the bounty hunter, or Silas Vane, the avenger. He was Marshal Vane. He had accepted the weight of the badge, and in doing so, had finally, fully, become a part of the community he had sworn to protect. The silence was still his nature, but now it was the steady, reassuring silence of a guardian watching over his flock. He had found a new purpose, not in the taking of life, but in its preservation. Years passed, flowing like the now tamed waters of the Crimson River. The seasons turned, painting the valley in the vibrant colors of life, and Crimson Gulch grew from a hard-scrabble settlement into a proper town. The dam held strong, a testament to the community's shared will. New homes were built with timber from the surrounding hills, their windows glinting in the sun. The laughter of children, a sound once as rare as a spring rain, now filled the dusty streets. Marshal Silas Vane was the bedrock upon which this new prosperity was built. His legend grew, but it was a different kind of legend now. Travelers spoke of a town in a hidden valley where the law was an unshakable, silent man who settled disputes with a gaze and whose presence alone was enough to keep the peace. Outlaws and grifters learned to give Crimson Gulch a wide berth. There was no profit to be made in a town protected by a ghost who wore a star. Silas aged, the harsh lines on his face softening, the fire in his eyes banking to a low, steady ember of watchfulness. The black of his hair and beard was shot through with threads of silver, like frost on a winter branch. He never spoke, but the town learned to read his language of quiet nods, subtle gestures, and the rare, almost imperceptible upturn of the corners of his mouth that passed for a smile. He was a constant, a living monument to their survival and rebirth. He taught Toby how to track, how to read the land, and, most importantly, how to handle a gun with respect and restraint. The boy grew into a young man, strong and steady, his character forged in the image of his silent mentor. He became Silas's unofficial deputy, the voice to the marshal's silent will. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Silas sat on the porch of the marshal's office, formerly the general store, watching a group of children play in the square, a lone rider approached. He was old, his back bent, his face a roadmap of a hard-lived life. He moved with a pronounced limp and led a weary-looking mule. It was Jedediah Stone. The town fell silent. The children stopped their game. A palpable tension, an echo of a violent past, gripped the square. People moved to their doorways, their hands resting uneasily on the pistols and rifles that had become a part of their household, a lesson learned and never forgotten. Jed did not look at them. His eyes, stripped of their former cruelty and filled now with a hollowed-out weariness, were fixed on Silas. He stopped his mule before the marshal's office. He was a broken man, a ghost of a different sort, haunted by the memory of his own downfall. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, his voice, a dry, rattling whisper, broke the silence. "I heard," he rasped, gesturing vaguely at the peaceful town. "Heard you done right by this place. I ain't here for trouble, Marshal. Just passing through. Thought I should see it. See what I destroyed. And what you built." Silas looked at the man who had maimed him, who had caused him so much pain. He felt no hatred, no desire for vengeance. That fire had burned out long ago, its ashes scattered by the winds of time and purpose. He saw only a pathetic, lonely old man at the end of a wasted life. Silas stood up slowly. He walked down the steps and over to the town well. He worked the pump, filled a dipper with cool, clear water, and walked back to Jed. He held it out to him. Jed stared at the offered water, his eyes filling with tears. It was an act of grace he did not deserve, an act of forgiveness he had never imagined possible. He took the dipper with a trembling hand and drank deeply. Without a word, Silas turned and walked back to his chair on the porch. The gesture was clear. Drink, and then move on. Jedediah Stone finished the water, tied the dipper back to the well, and, without looking back, shuffled away, his mule trailing behind him. He disappeared over the ridge, a final, pathetic phantom fading from the town's history forever. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square, the town slowly came back to life. The tension eased. The blacksmith went back to his forge, the saloon doors swung open, and the children, after a moment's hesitation, resumed their game. Toby, now a man in his own right, came and stood beside Silas's chair. "You could have killed him?" he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Silas watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He looked at the town he had helped build, at the people he protected. He thought of the long, bloody road he had traveled, from a vengeful ghost to a silent guardian. The thirst for revenge had been a raging fire that had consumed him, but the quiet work of building, of protecting, of forgiving that had been the water that finally quenched the flames. He didn't need to kill Jedediah Stone. His life, and the life of this town, was the only statement that mattered. He looked at Toby, and for the first time anyone could remember, a genuine, warm smile touched his lips and reached his eyes. He raised a hand and placed it on the young man's shoulder. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. In the profound and peaceful silence of Crimson Gulch, everything had already been said. The story of the silent man was complete, written not in words, but in the enduring spirit of a town that had learned the truest meaning of justice, courage, and peace from a ghost who wore a star.